Well, thank you all very much for coming. I can't believe how many of you there are. It's brilliant, especially on such a rotten day. I left the station and immediately walked into the biggest puddle. I mean, it was one of those puddles where there's just the top of your hair and that's all you can see. So that was a really good start. But yeah, thank you very much for coming. It's so nice to see everyone. And brilliant to be here. What an amazing place to be doing a talk. And libraries are incredibly important in my life, and I'm sure in all of your lives. And it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to support, such a brilliant festival in one of the most beautiful buildings in Britain. I mean, it's incredible. So so that is great. So I'm going to do a talk about Iconicon, which is my most recent book. And I've written a couple of books before this one. The first one was called Concretopia, and that told the story of the rebuilding of Britain in the post-war period, sort of 45 to 79. And walking around Bethnal Green, it just kind of reminded me that I remember I was thinking at one point, I could have just written the entire book just based in Bethnal Green. Because there isn't really anywhere else, I don't think, where you have the whole sweep of that story, of that period, written so clearly on the streets as you walk around. It's quite phenomenal. And yes, so I wrote that one. Then I wrote a book that was a bit more personal about growing up on the edge of the Greenbelt in Croydon, which is where I come from. And the story of the Greenbelt, because I felt like that was one of those things where people talk about the Green, we all talk about the Greenbelt, but almost none of us know what that actually is. And so that was sort of the point of this. And then this book is a sort of continuation really of the story of Concretopia. It starts in 1980 and takes us up to more or less the present day. And again, I was sort of intrigued about the sorts of things that have been built, this time during my lifetime. And all those things that I hadn't really noticed. So that was sort of what the book is noticing all the things I'd slightly edited out in my head all those years. And I think, that was sort of one of the surprising bits of it, really. So since March 2020, we've been living through one of the strangest periods in modern British history, stranger than the oil shocks or the three-day weeks of the 1970s, or stranger than the riots of 1981 or 2011, stranger than the Brexit referendum, stranger and even more powerful than the Y2K millennium bug. An unintended consequence of this pause in normal activity caused by pandemic and lockdowns and social distancing has been how it offered us a moment to step off the treadmill of our everyday usual routines, so commuting or office work or shopping and leisure, and instead we spent our days in an environment of total work or on holidays at home, which was so weird. We grew used to the streets on our doorstep. On exercise walks and mindfulness moments, we saw the truth of the places around us. But what was it we saw? Over-ambitious new extensions, grey paved drives and grey window frames and grey render, weird conversions, tiny infill houses, 30 semis with Kentucky Fried Georgian front doors and Victorian conservatories on the back, blocks of flats and neighbouring new build estates, amazing reuse projects, high-tech relics and postmodern ruins, former council blocks surrounded by brick-clad interlopers, old schools that have been converted into flats, and new schools that look like flats. The so-called parks for business or retail, and the knackered landscapes of casual habitation, sometimes unplanned in their chaotic muddle and competing horrors, and sometimes surprising and beautiful and hugely inspiring. So this afternoon, we're going to go on a time-travelling journey around London in the last 40 years. We can't see everything from my book, Iconicon, today, so to give you a chance, if you don't get a chance to read it, a few of the stories in it, you can gasp at King Charles's new build workhouses and fake Georgian squares in Poundbury, his new town, where the dreams of the place seem best summed up by a shop that I saw there that sells second-hand wedding dresses. Or you can be overcome by Leeds' very own version of postmodern architecture called the Leeds Look, which is like a Mount Rushmore of John Majors. You can be awestruck by Wonder World, which is essentially going to be the Millennium Dome to be built outside Corby in 1982, with water slides and monorails, besides zones on health and safety and banking. Or you can marvel at the luxury transparent swimming pool built in mid-air in Nine Elms, where passers below can enjoy a view of the millionaire's Veruca bath. But let's start our journey at one of the most amazing icons of modern London. Lloyd's of London are the proud owners of Britain's most high-tech building, even if at the time it was built in the early 1980s, the architects had a massive row with their clients that they might, in the future, need to use computers in their extremely shiny futuristic offices. As at the Pompidou Centre, for Lloyd's, Richard Rogers made a play of putting all its services hung on the exterior of the building to create a big open space in the centre. Clinging to the outside, there are 33 metallic pods containing the building's toilets. Never have the loos been such a star feature. The top is a great glass barrel vault to mimic the Crystal Palace, and its steampunk aspirations are enhanced by magic tricks inside. The Adam Room is perhaps the most absurd of the lot, being the second recreation of Robert Adams' neoclassical Great Room from Bowood House in Wiltshire. The room had been bought at auction by Lloyd's in 1956 when Bowood was set to be demolished, and initially was recreated as the committee room in Terence Haysham's 1958 Lime Street office building. But currently it exists on the 11th floor of Richard Rogers' version, presumably killing time before relocation on a space station, or later Mars. So it's 1985 and Mick Jagger and David Bowie were recording a video for their Live Aid single, Dancing in the Street, in an empty warehouse in Canary Wharf. Now there wasn't much dancing in the street there in those days, what with there being very few people around or even streets. But that same year, a trio of new Docklands buildings were approved for Canary Wharf, and one was going to be the tallest in Europe. Developer Ware Travelstead organised a symbolic launch for the project on the site. He invited 200 bankers from across the world, along with the chairman of the Bank of England, who was going to turn the first sod of earth. But protests from local Docklands residents had begun in earnest. A lorry filled with a herd of sheep and 3 beehives had been driven to the site the night before and hidden in a shed. During the event, as the bankers sat by the marquee, a group of protesters on cranes above them unveiled banners emblazoned with the slogan, "Kill the canary, save the island." And sheep and bees were quickly driven to the marquee, and the sheep were shooed towards the seated bankers, knocking them all off their chairs. Not to be outdone, the beekeeper placed a hive on the spot where the ground was going to be dug and kicked it over, and many of the guests were stung. One Canada Square was designed by Caesar Pelli and is the undoubted icon of Docklands, but the roads beneath Canary Wharf were rather less successful. Sarah Fox, who was the project executive on the build, pointed me to the indirect road lighting that had been created by placing lights between carefully angled louvres on the wall of the tunnel leading down to the car park. Designed out of the Chicago office of US architect SOM rather than in London, like so much of Canary Wharf, one tiny and very symbolic problem had occurred. They put them so they're facing the wrong way, she explained. Most of them had never been to the UK and didn't have a clue that you drove on the left. And so helpfully, the supposedly concealed lighting instead dazzled the subterranean driver. So, buildings can be icons of lots of different things, and sometimes accidentally so. Most interestingly for me, I think they can be symbols of our politics and culture, encapsulating the dreams of a particular moment in time, or the flaws. In the mid-1950s, a young Newcastle accountant realised it would halve the cost of buying a house if he built it himself. And so he dug the foundations and fixed the concrete like one of those maniacs on grand designs. Except this was Laurie Barrett, and by 1979, his company had become the UK's #1 house builder, knocking out 10,000 homes a year. Barrett had a helipad installed in the grounds of his home, which enabled him to visit 2 building sites a day. And there were even adverts where actor Patrick Allen pretended to be him, jumping out of helicopters and terrifying everyone. Their speciality became a type of house designed to tempt first-time buyers onto the property ladder, the starter home. The developers took inspiration from an influential book produced in the heartland of Thatcher's Britain, the Essex Design Guide. It'd been produced by the county's planners in 1973, and it aimed to steer private developers to ditch all those lingering modernist pretensions, all those things I really like, and instead embrace the unique building character of the county and to re-establish local identity. And developers took the basic gist of the Essex Design Guide, the cul-de-sacs, the heritage-inspired pitch-roofed houses, but stripped out all of that local detail and offered instead a simplified corporate version. The conservatism of the result was put down to a need to rush blandly uncontroversial design through planning. And the arrival of computer-aided design helped too. At Wimpy, house designs could be saved to disk. Imagine. And sent to their 11 regional offices, where a bit of fiddling could be done to, say, choose appropriate materials, or not. In 1985, Barrett launched their premier collection, larger detached houses with up to 6 bedrooms, often in gated communities. That year, Margaret and Dennis Thatcher bought one beside Dulwich Park in South London. But the dream did not last. The Thatchers put it up for sale in June 1991, a year after Margaret had been ousted as Prime Minister, and they'd only spent 6 nights there in 6 years. The lucky new buyers could be reassured that all of Margaret's hand-picked Italian floor tiles and German kitchen equipment and ubiquitous heavy chintz, the sort of thing that Barrett and Thatcher both so boldly embodied, would still remain when they bought the house. Postmodernist extraordinaire Terry Farrell had been encouraged to enter a design competition for a site at Vauxhall by the president of the RIBA, and he'd been informed that no one else had entered. When I spoke to him, he said, "Now that sounds like my kind of competition." A government holding company, a mysterious body, had bought the site. The architects were unaware that it was going to be on behalf of the British Secret Service. Just 2 of his team were vetted and allowed to attend client meeting, where the jobs were explained to them as if in code. The functions of the spaces remained top secret. For example, there was much focus on a single central room in the building, a circus that all the others needed access to. The designers kept giving this important room fantastic views, and their clients kept telling them not to, until they finally admitted what it was for: shredding. If MI6 had wanted to remain invisible, Terry Farrell was not the architect to have chosen. As with all of Farrell's postmodern London buildings, such as Embankment Place, which is above Charing Cross Station, or Egg Cup House, the studios for TVAM, with its fiberglass egg cups all round the roof, MI6 displays a grand optimism, fusing heritage with forward thinking and unafraid to make a colourful statement. And also, it's been blown up 3 times in James Bond films, which is pretty cool by any standards. So the retail park of my youth was Purley Way in Croydon, which sprawled over the site of the old Croydon Airport and Power Station. Purley Way was a place where retailers piloted their stores. The first Sainsbury's home base in 1981, the first PC World in 1991. What a crucible. One thing for the architectural geeks among us, which I'm guessing is all of us, one thing we can enjoy is that each supermarket developed a unique look. So for heritage fans, we have hokey pitched roof, Tesco Bethan. Lovers of high tech have got Sainsbury's pretending all their new stores were derived from Norman Foster's Sainsbury Centre Art Gallery in Norwich. Over-varnished craft centres turn out to be Morrison's. Knock-off Palladian villas are Safeways. Asda stuck with an anonymous fiberglass airship or blank red brick facades, a style I think best described as Asdustrial. Meanwhile, eco-housing was rising. In South London, there was Beddington Zero Energy Development, or BEDZ, which reminds me of the biodome in Douglas Trumbull's 1972 film Silent Running. It's a combination of high-tech and hippie. BEDZ was designed by Bill Dunster for the Peabody Trust and opened in 2002. It was the world's first high-density, carbon-neutral housing development. And a third of the homes were for sale, a third were shared ownership, and a third were social housing. It was built on the site of a former sewage works. 80% of the timber and steel used have been reclaimed, with all of the materials renewable or recycled and sourced within a 35-mile radius. Water consumption was cut by up to 50% thanks to water flow regulators and rainwater being collected for toilet flushing and irrigation for the roof gardens. Back when it was built, the autonomous house was the ideal, a place where you generated all of your own energy and treated all of your own wastewater. But pretty soon, thinking had moved to much bigger thoughts of decarbonising the entire national grid. But these days, how brilliant does that original vision look in times of potential energy rationing? So visit Britain around the millennium and you'd find 27 major projects, art galleries, concert halls, museums, science centres, bridges, being constructed to celebrate that transient moment. In effect, a different competing, lottery-funded Guggenheim Bilbao was being launched almost every month for 3 years. The Eden Project, the Deep in Hull, the Millennium Centre in Cardiff, the Sage in Gateshead, the Imperial War Museum in Salford. Here's an instantly recognisable icon of contemporary London, the Millennium Dome, now the O2 Arena, sadly shredded earlier this year in Storm Eunice. So synonymous with the city is it that it's even the star of the opening titles of EastEnders. Though I was very sad that they didn't update the graphic with its latest "Someone Left a Cake Out in the Rain" incarnation. We can't move the millennium, its architect Mike Davies of Rogers Stirk Harbour recalled telling the Millennium Commissioners in a crunch meeting. In December 1996, his winning design for the central structure was shown off just 3 years before this as yet unstarted building had to be finished, fitted out and ready for opening. Davies is a high-tech Dumbledore, long pointed grey beard and half-moon specs perched on his nose, dressed from head to toe in bright red, as he has for decades. "We knew Greenwich inside out," said Davies, "because I'd stood on the site in March that year and I remember thinking, I don't think I've ever been so cold in my life. I checked and there was no land over 200 feet between the Millennium Dome and Siberia." This huge circular 365-metre tent would nestle perfectly into the bend in the Greenwich Peninsula. the poisoned site of the old gasworks. 12 masts would hold up the tent, and the edges were pulled into 24 scallops. I think you're getting the kind of the theme of the building there with all of those references. There were mutterings in the architectural press that the design was merely a version of Fry Otto Stadium for the 1972 Munich Olympics. And the dome's lead structural engineer, Ted Happold, had worked with Otto on some of his extraordinary vast suspended tents. But Davies said that his inspiration went back even further. He wanted to recreate the sense of wonder he had felt when visiting the Festival of Britain, aged 9. When the UK headquarters for Swiss Re opened at 30 St Mary Axe in 2004, its architect Norman Foster said, "I've mellowed like everyone else." And he was referring to its popular name, the Gherkin. Bear in mind, at this point, he was still very sure that his high-tech blade of light across the Thames was now known as the Wobbly Bridge. The building itself was a sensation and immediately began appearing on all skyline depictions of London in adverts and on coffee cups beside the Houses of Parliament, St Paul's and the London Eye. Robin Partington, the architect for Foster's, called it an analogue building because it wasn't designed on computers. It was more about lots of cardboard and plastic, he said. We didn't have the computer skills then to work out the design that way. But they did use computers to work out how to build the twisty-turny design that they'd settled on. One of the most boggling elements of the finished building is that, smooth and circular as it is, it only contains one piece of curved glass, which is the dome on the top. Everything else is faceted. It's been built on the site of the Baltic Exchange, whose ruined shell was all that was left of the Edwardian edifice after being bombed by the IRA in 1992. Owners Trafalgar House had engaged the services of Foster, who initially designed for them what would have been the tallest building in Britain, Millennium Tower. It was going to be a steel and glass slab of sky gardens, luxury flats and offices, topped with what looked like 2 surprised rabbit ears. And the City of London was quick to kill that off. Enter insurance company Swiss Re, who engaged Foster to design a completely different building on the same site, half the height of its previous one, but with an emphasis on sustainability. I think these days, one of the real kind of tragedies of the Gherkin, it's such a successful building. This is one of the few kind of like areas of London where you can actually still see the building from a distance. You know, in East London is the only place really that you can see the Gherkin now, because everywhere else it's been surrounded by what looks like a weird fan club of giants that have been built around it, mobbing it. David Adjaye has become the hipster uncle of British architecture over the last 2 decades. His Bernie Grant Art Centre in Tottenham, alongside his 2 idea stalls, launched him as a major architect of public buildings at the height of the New Labour era. And his trademarks of combining high-tech design with unfinished materials creates buildings of real character with a lived-in feel. Quality design with a social purpose has underpinned his practice and has helped create 3 incredible community hubs whose generosity feels very much from another era. When London unexpectedly won the Olympic bid in 2005, proposals included 4 new permanent sporting venues in Stratford, which would end up as the stadium, now home to West Ham, the Copper Box multi-sport indoor arena, which was designed by Make, Zaha Hadid's aquatic centre, and the velodrome, now the Lee Valley Velo Park by Hopkins. In the park, 5 neighbourhoods would be built, forming a district almost big enough to call itself a town, with the same postcode, E20, as fictional Walford in EastEnders. The Pringle-shaped velodrome, designed by Hopkins, was the first of the venues completed and on budget, and its red cedarwood cladding makes it feel more furniture than architecture, and also hides the classic Michael Hopkins tent beneath, the roof suspended on a vast net of cables. But then there's the Aquatic Centre, one of only a handful of major structures in Britain designed by Zaha Hadid. It was a scramble to get it ready in time, and in classic Zaha style, she blew the budget 3 times over. But by this stage in her career, no one was going to argue with Zaha. Now in London, the iconic buildings of the last decade have been those terraces of flat-fronted brick flats and houses with Georgian proportion windows and metal balconies. They are the children of Tate Modern, and they speak of an era of austerity and conservatism, of homes as investments rather than places to be lived in. In time, they will become a shorthand for our age, just as 1930s semis are for the interwar era. The result is Farrow and Ball architecture, tasteful after decades of yellow brick Wendy houses and fiberglass, aluminium and stained render faux modernism. These days, with working from home, the new normal for many, the brick facades and blank windows and the tired faces peering into the glow of laptops beyond announces this style as the neo-workhouse. This new style of architecture has quickly become ubiquitous, thanks in part to then London Mayor Boris Johnson's London Housing Design Guide, published in 2010. And you can see them all over the world, that style of flat now, suddenly. The period I've been working in, we feel like we're operating under the radar, and it's kind of guerrilla tactics, architect Peter Barber told me. And it's slightly despite the government position and the cultural thrust, he said. These days, there are hundreds of architecture students across the country inspired by his work and that of contemporaries. Unlikely as it seems now, he worked for a time for high-tech king Richard Rogers and statement architecture guru Will Alsop on architecture whose prime qualities were lightness and prefabrication in glass and steel. But a visit to an exhibition of Portuguese modernist Álvaro César's work at the Architectural Association was a turning point for Peter Barber, fascinating him with a more solid and sturdy style. A recent Peter Barber project, Ordnance Road in Enfield, is one of a series of infill schemes he designed for that local authority. And the first thing that strikes you about his pale brick terraced housing is the curves. There are rounded edges on the street corners, but there are more extravagant touches too. Grand brick arches built into the fabric of the building, straight from 1920s Vienna. The local authority had been expecting a block of flats built on the site with a single point of access. Not 11 three-storey council houses at the front and a mews of 4 bungalows at the back, each home with its own front door. When I asked him about that, and I said, were the council happy? Was it easy, straightforward to get that made? And he couldn't speak for about a minute. He just sat there with his head in his hands. So I took that as a no. At the start of 2020, I'd taken a look at some houses being built near where I grew up, in New Addington, a housing estate in Croydon. And they were quite a curious bunch. They were tacked onto the back wall of a massive new leisure and community centre. Out the front, the bulky buff brick structure contained a cafe, a gym, a pool and a community hall with a sports hall on the top floor housed in a huge light box that overhung the plaza out the front like an invading spaceship from Independence Day. Oh my goodness, I realised as I stood there. New Addington has only gone and got itself an icon. I mean, not a real icon, obviously, it's not the V&A Dundee, but they had a go. The strangest thing was that the rear of the building, clinging to the brick facades, sat 8 single-aspect flat-fronted brick townhouses, roof terraces, cowering beneath a vast, noisy wall of air vents from the pool and gym. This is the kind of hybrid multi-use development being encouraged by cash-strapped councils across the country. Assets are being monetised and as quickly as possible. Increasingly in this sort of new post-Liz Truss era, I mean, that's speeding up to a kind of ridiculous degree. I wonder what this will mean for the future of our towns and cities. So meanwhile, I think the aspirations of our current era can best be summed up by a hoarding that I saw put up by the developers of a place called Everything Nine Elms. Everything Nine Elms? Food, drink, fitness, art, and chance encounters on a par with the best of everywhere. I mean, what does that even mean? And what kind of dreams are those? It's a funny old world we're moving into, I have to say. And thank you very much. You've been very patient.
So we're loading up now. If anyone's got any questions they'd like to ask John or contributions?
Hiya.
Thanks, I've enjoyed your books tremendously.
Oh, thank you.
I just wondered how you selected the buildings. Did you have a particular criteria for space or decade or style of architecture?
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny one, that really. Sort of start off with quite a fixed idea. You sort of, when you do a book like this, you sort of write a book proposal and you sort of like write, you know, you sort of try and break down what the book's going to be. You sort of imagine what the finished book's going to be like before you've written any of it. And I, you know, the same thing with Concretopia. I sort of wrote this book proposal, and then by the time the book was finished, I looked at the book proposal and was like, I don't agree with any of this. Who wrote this? Who wrote this book proposal? It bears no resemblance to the finished book at all. So what happens sort of is, I sort of break it down roughly into what I think the story is. So I sort of worked out, you know, roughly what I thought the story of this era was and what the sort of key things I wanted to talk about. But sometimes the things that I thought were going to be really interesting, when I researched them, sort of weren't really. And then sometimes something I'd never heard of or something that I just ignored turned out to be incredibly interesting and would sort of catch my eye. So sort of it just kind of evolves quite a lot. So I think I have an idea at the beginning of the sort of story I want to tell, but I think I try not to be too rigid about that because life kind of intervenes with that really. And also, you know, a lot of it is down to sort of interviewing people. You know, these books are sort of made out of people's stories. I do a lot of interviews with residents and with, you know, architects and planners and stuff to try and get a sort of idea of, you know, what the idea of a place was before it was built, and then what it was actually like when it was finished. You know, it's sort of, I find that really fascinating. And so sometimes, you know, I just can't find anyone to talk about a particular thing, and it's a bit disappointing. So it sort of becomes less important in a narrative, you know, unless I can find an in some way. I sort of feel like I'm slightly cheating the reader by then, you know, pretending I've had intimate access to something that I actually haven't. So that also will kind of change it. I feel like I bang on and on when I'm writing these books, constantly going on about, you know, on social media, you know, I need access to whatever it is, you know, a particular building or a particular sort of thing. And does anyone know anyone, blah, 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 who lives here, or, you know, do you live in one of these places? And sort of usually tumbleweed, silence. And then what happens is the books come out, and then loads of my friends go, oh, my nan designed that, or, oh, I live there. And at that point, I usually go crazy. So that again sort of informs how the books are sort of done, is emissions as much as what I can get, you know.
Right. I've read both your books actually, and the first one actually I was, you know, reading it over again sort of at the weekend, and I came on the page where you visited Chris Street Market in Lansbury and Poplar, and I'll just you wrote, walking around Chris Street Market today, it remains a recognisable festival-style development just after the Second World War, with its swing pillars, flat roofs, and classic post-war clock tower with its hands. Anyway, the market is intended to be the focus of local life, as the architect intended, to make the community look inward towards itself to be real neighbourly in effect. Despite the location at the heart of the East End, there's something urban about Lansbury Estate, which we I won't go on to describe with it. But the reason why I mention it is because it's a pity you didn't do your observation today, because basically Lansbury Estate and Christmas Street Market, for those of you who don't know, has been taken over by Poplar Harker in conjunction with the Labour Council as it was then, and to be changed from what the description I described. And I don't want to embarrass any Labour councillor who may be present here today. But I used the shops around the market, and one of them said to me, "We hate this because our rents are going up." And they said to me, "You're a journalist, why don't you do something about it?" I did. And basically I stood for a by-election in Lansbury Ward. The previous councillor actually had to resign because he was splitting his...
Sorry, can you, other people got their hands up, so I need you to finish, right?
Yeah, this usually happens actually,
Yeah,
you know,
right.
people interrupt.
But
But anyway, just to say, I mean, the point of what I was trying to say was that, I mean, so what is happening now, that the post-war sort of idea of community, etc., has now been sort of, well, literally demolished. The co-op is gone.
sorry, can you...
The police station is gone. And let John answer for himself. You know.
There are other people who have their hands up, they've come to this meeting, they've come through the rain to come here.
Anyone else
You've had
want
your
to come
minute,
in?
so please.
No, there you are. Thank you. I'm nearly finished, so don't worry. Don't panic. You come here to you learn things. The police station is gone. The co-op is gone. The car park is gone.
What's
The
your
post
question,
office is gone.
What's your question?
My question is, it's a pity you didn't come back now and sort of inform people of what it will be look like. Because basically, when they're finished, it's going to be this gentrified area, and people of the old East End are going to be pushed out. So my whole question is about, the theme of all these new developments is gentrification. You understand that?
Anyone else? John, do you want to answer that? Or you want to...
Well, I think, no, I agree that is, we see that happening all over the place. I used to live in Elephant and Castle, the Haygate estate got demolished and replaced by a lot of kind of luxury housing that, they had initially promised that there was going to be loads of social housing in it, and the social housing that ended up getting built in it was a tiny, tiny fraction of what was happened. And the same, you look at Robin Hood Gardens, the big kind of Peter and Addison Smithson thing, that's, been demolished, and again, there's sort of very similar thing happening there. And it is, it is incredibly depressing. I'm not a campaigning, writer. The thing that I do is I just try and tell sort of social history of the period that I'm writing about. And so I hope that by highlighting the stories of how somewhere like Lansbury got built and how it came about, that will actually allow people to feel more invested in those places and defend them and talk about them and understand them a bit more. So, so I guess from my point of view, I sort of feel like that's what I'm trying to do, is I'm trying to sort of engage people in the history of these places so that we all sort of understand why these places are so important and why we shouldn't lose them, and why that's so bad to lose these places.
Did you feel a responsibility to make sure you had a selection across the whole of Britain? Was that quite challenging?
Yeah, I did. I did really. I didn't want to. I was very keen not to just do. So today I've just talked about London because I thought that would be sort of interesting. And there's so much stuff to talk about with London that it's quite easy to just sort of tell the whole story. As I said, you could almost tell the whole story just with Bethnal Green. But I do want to try and include as many different places as possible, because it's very easy to kind of use the kind of really famous examples to talk about a particular subject, but sometimes it's interesting to actually talk, to to find a different place and maybe sort of tell the story through a different angle. I do find that really interesting. So I did make a sort of effort to travel around. What happened with the end of this book? So I was about 3/4 of the way through doing it, and then lockdown happened, and I had got trips to Gateshead and Cardiff the week that lockdown happened, and I was supposed to be going there to go interview a load of people, and then I had to cancel those interviews. Luckily, I was able to do the interviews over Zoom, and luckily I already knew both places quite well, so it wasn't like a complete disaster. And it turned out Zoom was amazing for interviewing people. Beforehand, before the pandemic, the thought that I could interview, people via a webcam was sort of, impossible to imagine. I just thought, imagine trying to tell somebody how to use a webcam to do an interview. It go on for hours. And now everybody's really keen to do that. So it's sort of, that has really changed the accessibility of some people who were sort of difficult to get hold of before, and now it's actually a lot easier to interview people. So it was a bit swings and roundabouts with this book, where there were certain places like Morecambe. So there was a whole story about Morecambe that I wanted to do, and Morecambe was one of the places that got dropped in the end. And that was my regret from Iconicon, was that I didn't get to do Morecambe, because I've never been to Morecambe. I was really interested because Morecambe is supposed to be getting the Eden Project 2. There's loads of really interesting stuff around the decline, because Morecambe's had a sort of Detroit style, like, hollowing out and decline. There's also been these very interesting kind of attempts to try and do a new version of social housing there, that I wanted to see how successful that had been, and then I didn't get to go because I couldn't. So that was a shame. But yeah, I do try and make them panoramic as I can. I don't drive, so everything has to be done on a train. So that slightly limits things. Yeah, thanks, Mr. Beeching.
Are there any buildings that you changed your opinion on once you started researching them?
Oh, loads. Yeah, absolutely. So the Millennium Dome is really interesting. So I went to the Millennium Dome. How many people went to the Millennium Dome when it was the Dome? Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot of us. And I remember going there with a group of people from work, and we had like a day out there. And I actually spoke to one of those people a couple of months ago, and she was like, all I remember was I went home and I had the worst headache, and I just had to go to sleep for like 3 hours. And we just kind of walked around, and I remember being like, the building just felt incredible, felt like an amazing sort of spaceship. But because the stuff in it was so variable, there were some really amazing things in it, and some really not so less amazing, sub-amazing things going on in it. I remember particularly there was the thing about the economy, which was, some giant diorama of a £1 coin clunking along through it, and it was like, oh, kill me now, awful. And then some of it was really cool. I remember there was that thing where you could do like, there was like a sort of giant iPad thing, but like years before there were iPads that you could kind of do, all that stuff was amazing. So in retrospect, I felt like I sort of slightly went along with everybody's kind of, ripping the piss out of the Millennium Dome at the time. And then after a while, I think the thing about all of these Millennium projects is I remember at the time, we were all really cross about the Millennium. That's my memory of the Millennium, was everybody was very cross and sneery about everything that was done for the Millennium, whether it was the buildings, whether it was the celebrations, whatever it was, we were just cross about it. It just felt like it was terribly kind of un-British to try and have fun and do some education. Awful. And now, in retrospect, we kind of look at those, but also my recollection is all those buildings failed. It was all a disaster. Everything was rubbish. Everything failed. But actually, I think about two things failed. There was like hardly any of those Millennium projects actually collapsed. Lots of them evolved and sort of turned into something else, or kind of, kept changing. But that obviously happens to everything. But most of them actually were actually pretty great. And I think we look back now, I suddenly see this little shining light of kind of optimism and excitement in a sort of Festival of Britain sort of way that at the time I sort of felt like I didn't really appreciate. And yeah, I sort of lived through that, and I went to a lot of those things at the time and didn't really notice how exciting it was. And now we live in such a miserable age, you know, just dominated by terrible, terrible people. That looking back on that, you know, you just think, well, this is extraordinary, you know, that something really positive and optimistic happened. And remember optimism? Wow. Turns out it's quite fun, quite innovating. Sorry, who?
Hand up, gentleman there? No?
No?
In front of you.
If you go to the Barbican shop now, you can see it's just full of merchandising
Yes.
for concrete stuff and the rest of it. And you talked about coming here to Bethnal Green, and we're kind of surrounded by my allotment. It's got the Dennis Lasdon prototypes for Keening House and all that kind of stuff.
Amazing.
And that kind of spirit to which the guy there was talking about as well. Did you find, in terms of looking at this work you're talking about, there is a kind of sense of a kind of counterculture? There is because it's become a lot of young people are really interested in it now, whether it's to do with the look or the context of how the stuff came about and times and who it's for and all that kind of stuff. And you know what I always find is interesting, it's where modernity and working class lives come together, which is so unusual. But did you find going around that there are things that that's quite exciting, or is it really all just money as the driving force now?
Well, there are really. I mean, Peter Barber and, you know, the Goldsmith Street thing, which happened, which was an amazing social housing and passive house building in Norwich. That, you know, it's a sort of street, you know, whole street that was, you know, amazing. I sort of feel like one of the lovely things that happens now is I get to meet students. I get to sort of talk to students about architecture, and they are generally really massively inspired by those kind of socially conscious architects and architecture. And there is a whole wave of people rising kind of in architecture who aren't the kind of, you know, shiny breadheads that we kind of think of as the people that took over architecture, really. And, you know, one of the things I really liked about the post-war period when I was writing about it was that all the really big architects of that period, they all did social housing, and they all did, you know, they all worked for local authorities and that sort of stuff, you know, and then they might have moved on and did private practice after that. But, you know, I sort of found that really inspiring. And it's interesting that the students I talk to have got a similar interest in that and are similarly intrigued by it. And I guess also because we live in an era where we don't get big social housing projects being built anymore. You know, that was all knocked on the head, and we instead had the right to buy and all of that. Philosophy was sort of, you know, around kind of generosity generally in that post-war, you know, idea of sort of, you know, trying to make life better for everyone and more equal for everyone. It's, you know, that I think a lot of young people find that really incredibly intriguing, and there's a lot of really positive lessons in that. And I think so. Yeah, I do think there is quite a lot of stuff to be optimistic about. Also, the environmentally conscious, you know, aspects of modern architecture and design. You know, the fact that there's this big movement towards reusing existing buildings rather than knocking them down and that sort of stuff. You know, and that things that, you know, we were quite happy to just knock down great big buildings like the Tricorn Centre or whatever, you know, in the 90s and in the noughties, you know, knock them down, just knock them down. And, you know, and even quite recently, you know, like I mentioned that estate in Elephant and Castle, you know, just entirely razed. Robin Hood Gardens still being knocked down now, you know, you still get terrible examples of this happening all the time. But now there's a debate around that stuff in a way that there sort of wasn't really before. You know, that, you know, when we were talking about, you know, the reasons to save these buildings, it, you know, if you're only resting on kind of aesthetic grounds, then forget it. I mean, that's never going to win. but you know, if there were kind of more grounds for keeping a building, then I think that has meant that the whole sort of green movement in architecture is sort of driving the future of what we can do, I think, much more than maybe people realised it would sort of even sort of 10 years ago. I think that's an optimistic thing too. But God, there's a lot to be pessimistic about, isn't there? So I was conscious when I wrote this that, you know, the story of Concretopia I found incredibly inspiring. I found all that post-war stuff really inspiring. What I didn't want to do with this book was then go, and then it was all awful. And so I have tried to find things that I felt were inspiring in this era, even if they're very different from the other era. And I sort of feel like what's happened time-wise is a bit like Butterfly's Wings, the two books and the two periods, in that you've got that kind of hinge point of 1979, where you've spent, you know, the post-war period moving towards kind of more equality and more fairness, more council housing, you know, the welfare state and all that stuff. And then that all sort of, you know, gets up to we start to kind of funnel in the other direction, less of all of those things over time. And now we've got back to kind of like 1930, and we've got back to, you know, you only get nice things if some philanthropist throws some money at it, rather than, you know, we actually build that into the way that we structure our politics and our, you know, and our lives generally. So there was a sort of sadness around that, really. So there's a sort of, I mean, I try not to be an angry writer, but it's hard not to be angry about some things.
One last question.
Do you think, given what you've actually said the last few minutes, do you think that there's any point in town planning anymore? That university curriculum now, about 13 universities have town planning as a subject which studies at degree level, must well be abolished.
Yeah, I mean, poor old town planners. I sort of feel like town planning as a discipline, it kind of killed itself. You know, it kind of colluded with this idea that, you know, that planning should just be, you know, we should move away from doing big things. We should do small interventions rather than big things. And that sort of undermined the whole point of town planning slightly, you know, and so poor old town planners now are having to deal with a kind of legacy of slightly timid people 30 years ago going, oh no, we don't want to do any of those new towns anymore. And you're right, you know, there were a lot of, you know, that felt like a sort of subject that we took a lot more seriously years ago. And I do, you know, I was chatting to some young town planners the other day, and they were all surprisingly optimistic. I mean, you know, that wasn't something I think I was expecting them all to be a bit kind of like, oh well, whatever, you know. And they were, you know, and they were determined not to settle with, you know, oh yeah, we'll just do some permitted development on a, you know, back of somebody's house or whatever. You know, they were determined for that not to be the point of their careers, and that they were sort of, you know, again, a bit like these young architects actually sort of grabbing hold of this idea of their work being more politically and socially conscious and worth something, and therefore, you know, and those people will be the people who are running, you know, who will be sort of in charge of town planning in a few years' time, you know. So for me, that feels optimistic, I think, whereas I feel like there was a moment where town planning became a kind of byproduct of estate agents for a while, which was not really the point. So, yeah, for me, it feels a bit more optimistic now.
Thank you, John. That's a fantastic speech there. I think everyone really enjoyed it. Thank you all for coming today. Can you give a big round of applause to John?
Thank you very much.